I'm going to start by looking at the arguments made on both sides of the green growth debate. So people who think that we can continue to grow our consumption even in rich countries, contrasted with people who think that continued consumption growth, at least in rich countries, has got to stop if we're going to get back within safe planetary boundaries.
Growth, by the way, if it's not obvious, is what I'm talking about when I say growth is growth of GDP, gross domestic product, which is a measure of the market value, the market exchange value of all the goods and services that we produce in our economy. And the reason that we're worried about increasing GDP is because of this really quite uncannily close correlation between the exchange value of what we produce at a global level, which is the green line, that's gross world product in trillions of US dollars, and the consumption of resources. So the black line shows material consumption in gigatons, and the red line shows carbon dioxide emissions in gigatons. And the correlation between GDP and carbon emissions is even more obvious when we look at the annual percentage change in both of those things. So the red line there is GDP, and the grey line there is CO2 emissions, the percentage change in both of those measures. And you can see how contractions and slowing down and accelerations of GDP are reflected really closely in CO2 emissions. If this graph went further, of course, we'd see an enormous drop as a result of the pandemic in both measures. And of course, because countries like ours, the UK, because we're responsible for very high levels of per capita emissions, carbon emissions per person, and because people living in countries with much lower levels of GDP really need to have the ecological space to increase their consumption, the argument is that we in the rich world need to reduce our consumption. Otherwise, we're not going to leave. We've already been appropriating way more than our fair share of the Earth's resources. So to make space for populations in the global south to increase their consumption of resources, we're going to have to adapt to slower or negative rates of growth. So that's the basic argument. And the people kind of who on this growth skeptic side of the debate sometimes will identify as steady state economists following Herman Daly. Sometimes they'll identify as degrowth advocates. Sometimes they'll identify as wanting prosperity without growth, following the work of Tim Jackson, or a well-being economy, following the work of Catherine Trebeck and colleagues, or a donut economy following the work of Kate Raworth and others. So there's lots of different labels that get used here. I use a sort of umbrella term of post-growth economists for people who fall into this broad group. The other side of the debate, we have green growth advocates who think that all we need to do, what we need to do is decouple GDP growth from growth in resources. And decoupling is quite a technical concept, and in order to explain it, I'm going to break down the different determinants. This is CO2 emissions, but you could equally have a similar equation for any resource that we use that we're worried about bumping up against planetary boundaries for. What determines our total CO2 emissions are these four factors. There's the size of the population, there's the income per person in that population, and then there's a sort of technology factor that includes both the energy required for each pound's worth of income or each pound's worth of consumption, and then there's the carbon dioxide emitted for each kilowatt hour of energy. Okay, so there's kind of these four different factors that come together in an equation to determine total CO2 emissions. So this graph is showing all of those drivers on one graph. The top line is the CO2 emissions, then that green line is GDP per person, so consumption per person. The purple line is population, and then these lines at the bottom, the red line and the grey line, this is about reducing the intensity, the material intensity of that consumption. And it's these factors that are the focus of decoupling efforts, because in order to break the relationship between GDP and carbon dioxide, which you can see even on this graph is really closely correlated, we need these intensity measures to be going down extremely fast. That is what breaks that relationship or weakens that relationship. So, what you can see in this graph is something called relative decoupling, which means that we're getting slightly more efficient over time. So you can see the energy intensity of our consumption is decreasing and the carbon intensity of our energy is decreasing. So over time, we're doing a bit more with less. That's relative decoupling. But of course, that's just not good enough. Given the challenges that we face, we need to do what's called absolute decoupling. And what that would look like on the graph is if GDP continued to go up, but that pink line, carbon dioxide, went down. That would be absolute decoupling. And to do that, we need these intensity measures to be decreasing at a faster rate than GDP is increasing. Now, there are a few examples around the world of absolute decoupling taking place, and the UK is one such example. So here's a graph of the UK, and you can see that carbon dioxide emissions have been falling even while GDP has been rising. So green growth advocates will say, well, this is really encouraging. We just need to do more of this. This proves it's possible. And this proves that we can continue to grow our economies even while reducing our impact. So how would green growth skeptics respond to that? Well, probably the first thing they do is say, hold on a minute, let's make sure we're talking here about consumption-based emissions, because quite often in the graph that I just showed, and quite often in graphs that you will see presented by green growth advocates, what they're celebrating is reductions in the carbon dioxide associated with our production, which is the emissions coming from our territorial, from our territory, actually emitted from the stuff we produce. Whereas, and one of the reasons that that's declined so much over the last few decades is because we've decimated our manufacturing sector and we've been importing more and more of what we consume. So we need to make sure we're looking at the emissions associated with our consumption. And that's the red line at the top there. It's much less impressive once you can take into account consumption. The second thing that they'd observe is, yeah, of course, we need to decouple. But the faster we grow, the faster we need to decouple. And the challenge is already really, really big for us. So a 2% growth rate, it might not sound like a lot, but what that translates into is a doubling in the scale of our consumption every 35 years. So if we're doubling the scale of our consumption, we need to be decoupling much, much faster in order for that to result in the dramatic reductions in carbon emissions that we need. The third thing that I think growth skeptics would tend to highlight is that we've never approached the rates of decoupling necessary for rich countries to get back within their fair share of ecological space whilst growing at the rates that we're used to. So to maintain growth as normal, Annex 1 countries, which is the richer group of countries, which includes the UK, we would need to be achieving a rate of GDP decarbonisation of about 16% per year. And this is to pull our weight in the effort to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. As many of you will know, we really need to be getting down, keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees. So this is already a more relaxed goal than we really ought to be aiming for. But 16% per year, that's the kind of rate of decoupling we need to be looking at. At the moment, That's 10 times the rate that we're achieving in Annex 1 countries. So I mean, I could throw loads and loads of graphs at you to sort of demonstrate how far we are away from the rates of decoupling we need to achieve. But I don't really want to dwell on this technical stuff, because I'm going to there's a link there, Haber et al. That's a recent peer-reviewed scientific article reviewing the evidence on decoupling. If you want, they've concluded that it's going to be, for all intents and purposes, impossible to get back within planetary boundaries without reducing consumption. And also in the article that I published recently on Open Democracy, which is called Degrowth versus Green Growth, Degrowth versus Green Growth, there are links to articles looking at more specific things like the difficulty with rolling out negative emissions technologies, or the difficulty with rolling out renewable technologies at the rate that we that green growth optimists assume we can, etc., etc. And then there's also this report which has a nice cover, which is why I put that there, Decoupling Debunked. So how do green growth optimists respond to those arguments? Well, it is, to be honest, it's quite difficult to get people to look at that evidence. And that's the first thing to say. You know, it's boring, it's detailed, it's technical, it's esoteric. Those who do engage with it will tend to come back with one of three responses. Well, they may straightforwardly just say, well, the historical record is not a guide to what we can do in the future, and by being pessimistic, you know, your pessimism is going to be self-fulfilling. That's one argument you hear. Another is, okay, they'll acknowledge that it looks very challenging technically to achieve the rates of decoupling based on technology change, but they say, well, why can't we just shift then? Why can't we just shift the nature of our consumption away from material consumption and into the consumption of experiences? This is something that Richard Murphy brought up in his presentation for you, which was the last one in this series. He said, well, in my opinion, there's no limit to how much we can love each other or care for each other or entertain each other. So if we're paying for those kinds of services, can't our growth be based on that kind of consumption? Which is a really interesting argument. And the way that growth skeptics would respond to that, or at least the way that I respond to that, is by saying, yeah, we can and we should, and it would be great, a wonderful world if we reduced our material consumption, increased our consumption of massages and comedy shows and guided tours and I don't know, whatever else. The first thing is to say that all of those activities do have a material impact associated with them. It's very, very hard to think of anything you would consume that doesn't involve some kind of form of transport to get there, some kind of heated building to do the activity in, some kind of electronic database to store the information that you're using. So almost, it's very, very, I challenge you to think of any activity that could continue to grow exponentially, which doesn't have any material impact associated with it. But more to the point, our consumption of experience is limited by time. We only have so many hours in the day. There will come a point, if we're relying on consumption of experiences to grow exponentially, double every few decades, well, our time isn't doubling every few decades. Our leisure time is going to be quite limited. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, if we are relying on the exchange of immaterial care, education, the experience of nature, if we're relying on people paying for those kind of things to keep GDP going, aren't we going to end up commodifying experiences and things that we currently enjoy for free, or we should be enjoying for free? That's something I'm really concerned about. And where do we go from there? If you get that far through a conversation with a green growth advocate, quite often, or in my experience, they're typically left with this argument, which is that decoupling is our only hope, because nobody is going to vote for degrowth. And to illustrate that, there's an image of people on Boxing Day queuing for the Boxing Day sales, even in the middle of a pandemic. And I think that, to be honest, this is an argument that we need to take seriously. You know, we need to talk about solutions in a way that's going to resonate with those people for whom the current system doesn't work. People who've been ravaged by 40 years of neoliberalism and over a decade of austerity, because it's those people for whom the current system doesn't work who are going to make up the biggest potential group of allies in this struggle for change. And that group isn't going to respond very well to being told you need to consume less. And I'm not saying that that's the message of degrowth, but it can be interpreted as the message of degrowth. And one thing that I'm personally quite worried about is that the more time we spend in these really nerdy, impenetrable discussions about decoupling, the less time we've got to actually reach out, test different communication strategies, figure out what will allow us to build the broad-based movement that we need to take on the vested interests who benefit from the status quo. So the argument that I'm going to make in the second half of this presentation is that there is a set of demands that people who care about economic justice and environmental justice on both sides of this divide, growth optimists and growth skeptics, there's a set of demands that we should both be able to get behind, a set of demands that can stop us hurtling towards ecological collapse, and I think can resonate with the majority of people who are shafted by the current system. So what are they? They are limits on resource use and waste, the pursuit of decoupling through a Green New Deal or something similar, and an end to growth dependency. Now, the reason that I think that both sides of the debate should be able to sign up to these is that you don't have to be a degrowth advocate to recognize the need for tough environmental protections. Obviously, everybody knows we need to scale up the good stuff, public transport, insulation, renewables, and so on. But we also need to scale down the bad stuff. We need to ensure that the environmental benefits that we expect to get from our efficiency gains aren't compromised by the rebound effect. So the rebound effect is, I'm going to try and illustrate it here with these pictures. This is showing computers from 1940s, 1970s, 1990s, and today. Clearly, we have got more efficient in our production of computers. Computers today require much less resources than they did in the 1940s. But has the overall environmental impact of our consumption of computers gone up or down? Clearly, it's gone up, because many, many, many more people can afford these computers today because they require less resources to make. And that means that demand increases and consumption increases. So the scale of consumption matters, as well as the efficiency. And we know that capital, a big driver of growth, a big driver in scale of consumption under capitalism is efficiency gains. Here's another illustration of the rebound effect. Imagine you've invested in public transport. Brilliant, you've cut the costs of getting around, of mobility for millions of people. What do people do with the money they've saved? Because what they do with the money they've saved tells us whether this efficiency gain is going to result in overall reductions in resource use or not. What if with those money they save, they think, oh, I'm going to take an extra holiday next year. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fly to, I don't know, somewhere in Europe. If that's the case, then those efficiency gains are not going to result in overall material and resource consumption. So that's why we've got to take seriously the need for, and this is, you'll notice that whole argument didn't require us to go back and talk about decoupling. It just revolved around the basic concept of rebound, which lots of people can get their heads around. Now, it's important to stress here that the proposal here is for caps on resource, not GDP. I think one of the reasons that people balk at the idea of degrowth is that they imagine it involving some kind of descending cap on national income. And as far as I know, there aren't any serious thinkers in the post-growth community who are suggesting that we should try and control the market value of production and consumption at an aggregate level. That's, you know, it's an impractical project. I don't know how you do that, but it's also illogical, because why would you try and control a metric which is several steps removed from the biophysical impacts that matter, when we can design policies to directly control resource use, habitat destruction, pollution, and so on. Now, for growth to be genuinely green, it would have to take place within those limits. So if green growth advocates oppose resource caps, oppose regulation around pollution, then that would suggest that their confidence about the feasibility of achieving green growth is actually disingenuous. And there you can catch them out. But if they're serious, if they're genuine, then they'll sign up to that. The second thing is investment in pursuit of decoupling. And the reason both sides can sign up for that is because you don't need to be a green growther to recognize the need for technological transformation. Resource caps are not going to be a panacea on their own. They're only going to last if they're embedded in institutions and infrastructural transformations that enable everybody to live comfortably within those limits, not just the rich. And there's really broad agreement here, both from people in the degrowth movement and people involved with the Green New Deal agenda. Decoupling is not the problem. The pursuit of decoupling is not the problem. The problem is putting all of our eggs in the decoupling basket and not taking account of the risk that decoupling on its own won't be enough. And the third thing in this element is an end to growth dependency. And the reason that I think, again, both sides should be able to sign up to this is you don't need to be a degrowth advocate to support policies that would reduce our growth dependency. What do I mean by growth dependency? Well, we're currently dependent on growth to maintain economic and political stability. If GDP flatlines or contracts, then our economy tends to topple into crises of unemployment, debt, inequality, and hardship. And it's no wonder then that policymakers remain preoccupied with GDP, even though they will very readily admit that it's a poor measure of progress. So our growth dependence is a real straitjacket on policymakers. The spectre of shrinking or stagnating GDP has not only been invoked to block environmental policies, it's also been invoked to block food standards, labour rights. And most recently, it's been just used to justify the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions in workplaces, in spite of the risks to public health. So fear of the consequences of economic contraction has turned out to be a major impediment to the containment of a pandemic, just as it has proved to be a major impediment to effective climate policy. So that's why I describe our growth dependence as a straitjacket. When certain forms of economic activity imperil our health and our well-being or the living systems upon which we depend, our governments have to have the confidence to scale back those activities without fear of triggering economic crisis. And that confidence is only going to be won if we escape our growth dependence. Fortunately, our growth dependence is not an inevitable fact of life. And the reason I've got this report up here is this is a report I recently wrote, published by the University of Leeds, along with the Doughnut Economics Action Lab and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I describe in there 4 factors that underpin our growth dependence. And I highlight some opportunities for reducing those factors as part of our recovery from COVID-19. The last thing to say is that ending our growth dependence doesn't foreclose the possibility of growth. So it should still be palatable to green growth optimists. It simply makes our economy resilient. If the resource caps do end up constraining growth, we need our economy to be resilient in the face of economic contraction and shock. And who could object to our economy being more resilient in the face of economic shock? So what does ending our growth dependence mean? This is the last section of the presentation, and I'll do my best to get through it quickly. There's quite a lot to cover still. So there's 4 key parts of this strategy: empowering workers to reduce working hours, reducing our exposure to debt crises, tackling rent extraction, and safeguarding needs properly. So let's go through what each of these in turn. All else being equal, automation and other innovations are going to reduce the need for labor. And conventional economic wisdom says the way to deal with that is to stimulate consumption, and we can soak up the surplus labor. But of course, there's an alternative and more environmentally sustainable way to maintain employment, and that is to share out the remaining work. So instead of using productivity improvements to drive down prices and sell more goods, companies could offer their workers a shorter working week at a higher hourly rate. Now, that's not a solution that profit-orientated companies are going to deliver of their own accord. Obviously, it's going to require coordination and a major shift in the balance of power in workplaces, so that people who invest their labor are no longer systematically excluded from decision-making in workplaces. And the reason I've included this report here, commending the companies, because it's got lots of ideas for how we shift that balance of power in workplaces. The second thing, reducing our exposure to debt crises. Okay, so we're dependent on growth to maintain financial stability because our economy is really heavily burdened with private debt. Debts are promises to pay, and they're often based on expectations about the future, usually about revenue growth or asset price growth. And if those expectations don't come to pass, then debt obligations become really dangerously destructive. Because unlike equity investments that would shrink or grow with the fortunes of the firm, debts are fixed in nominal terms. And if the interest can't be paid, then debts grow exponentially. So high levels of indebtedness can transform a modest fall in expected growth rates into a full-blown crisis. And I just want to stress here, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to stress that public debt is not the concern here, for similar reasons that Richard talked about last week. We've got to resist any attempt to use the coronavirus debts as justification for a new round of austerity. New cuts are both unnecessary and counterproductive. First, because 42% of our public debt is owned to our own central bank. Okay, it's owed to ourselves. That means it can be rolled over indefinitely, as Japan has demonstrated. And secondly, because the cost of government borrowing is negative in real terms. Okay, so people are paying for the privilege of lending to the government. So it's a perfect time for governments to borrow and invest. I'll move on and not spend too much longer on that. So the focus now should be on reducing our exposure to private debt crises, and I've listed some ways that we can do that there, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A, or you can look at this presentation afterwards if you want in more detail. So the third thing is tackling rent extraction. So rent here, I'm not just talking about the money you pay to your landlord, although that is a really, that's the kind of archetypal example of rent. Rent is an unearned income that's extracted through control of monopolized or scarce assets. Okay, and so it happens right across the economy. Rentiers, people who extract rents, include landlords. That also includes financiers, monopoly interests, and so on. As long as the rate of growth, economic growth, remains higher than the rate of rent extraction, then the injustice of rent extraction can be masked to some extent. But if growth stalls, if wealth creation stalls, but landlords and financiers and monopoly interests and other rentiers continue to extract wealth, then the result is going to be rising inequality. In fact, you know, you can have a look at this paper that I've written, The Threat of Rent Extraction in a Resource Constrained Future, because I actually argue that all of these forms of growth dependence can be seen as one form or another of the rentier growth imperative. Now, diffusing rentier power, reducing the power of people to extract rents and redistributing rents is a really massive project. It requires changes right across the economy, from changing the governance of platforms like Facebook and Uber and Amazon, the intellectual property regime. Right now, with tax revenues from consumption and employment radically reduced, we've actually got an opportunity to push for fairer taxation of capital gains, dividends, monopoly profits, the rents, basically economic rents in the economy. And also with the mounting rent arrears on properties, both residential and commercial properties, could also provide an impetus for sort of a fundamental shift in the way we govern land and housing. So finally, the final kind of pillar of this strategy is safeguarding basic needs. All of the problems I've just listed, high unemployment, indebtedness, rent extraction, these things are all more dangerous in an economy like the UK, where essential goods and services like social care, energy, transport are rationed by price, i.e. your ability to pay. Because in that context, the ability of the poorest to meet their basic needs is obviously going to be threatened by a fall of income, which is also why carbon taxes, which are essential to meet our climate obligations, are so difficult to introduce under the current system. Now, there's nothing inevitable about this reality. We've lived with it for our whole lives, so we often take it to be inevitable that you should have to pay for these basic services. But of course, land, water, raw materials, energy resources, these are gifts from nature. You know, they're common resources, and they still account for more than half our national wealth. In an idea, if we'd had the privilege of designing the system from scratch, we'd make sure that the rents arising from control of these common resources would be captured and invested in collective services and a strong social security net to make sure that nobody goes short on life essentials, that everybody has access to their basic fair share of our common resources. But instead of that, we've allowed private interests to profit from the control and exploitation of these resources. And in fact, over recent decades, our publicly funded infrastructure has also been privatized, leading to rising prices for essential services like energy, water, and transport. And this is an image that I've just taken from the website We Own It, which I really recommend you check out for loads of evidence on the failures of privatization. I recommend you look at NEF's proposal for a minimum income guarantee for strengthening the social safety net, which is one of the weakest among advanced economies and in our own history. And I also recommend you look at this book on the case for universal basic services. I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I think I'm running about a little bit over time, so I want to wrap up. Basically, what I've tried to show is that the policies that we need to end our growth dependence actually speak directly to the needs of those who are suffering from precarity, exhaustion, and exploitation under the current system. Ending our growth dependence is about diffusing the power of rentiers, expanding economic democracy, establishing entitlements to a basic share of our commonwealth. It's about freeing up time for leisure, for caring for one another, for arts, education, democratic deliberation. And it's about protecting people from extractivism, just as environmental regulations protect the Earth's systems from extractivism. So thanks for listening.